For the past 5 years, a man has lived alone on a remote island in the Pacific Ocean after his fishing boat capsized. Initially overwhelmed by his circumstances, he gradually adapted to his new life through determination and ingenuity. Learning to create fire was one of his first challenges. He experimented with different methods and eventually discovered how to use friction to ignite dry materials. Over time, he mastered the art of fire making, identifying which types of wood burned best and how to sustain a flame. Though he was primarily a fisherman, he taught himself basic carpentry skills. He climbed trees to harvest wood, often cutting branches from the top down rather than from the base, which proved to be safer and more efficient. He reinforced his shelter with heavier timber, creating a more resilient structure to withstand harsh weather. With no fishing gear available, he innovated by crafting a makeshift fishing rod from a long, thick stick, which he carved to create a hook. After 6 months of trial and error, he learned to cast a simple net for fishing, successfully catching fish to sustain himself. Through experience, he discovered which foods were edible and which were not. Unfortunately, he misidentified some sweet berries that he thought were raspberries. After consuming them, he suffered severe gastrointestinal distress, experiencing cramps, sweating, and vomiting for 48 hours. It took him 3 days to recover, during which he learned the importance of caution in foraging. The island provided him with rainwater, which he collected using a system of containers. He had designated one for drinking, another for cooking, and a third for his small garden. He dug a simple cellar to store preserved food, ensuring he had enough provisions during dry spells. After 3 years, he significantly upgraded his shelter. He built additional structures using sturdy wood and designed a small boat to navigate around the shoreline, making it easier to gather resources without the exhausting trek on foot. To combat the island's winds, he constructed a curved wall that not only blocked gusts but also reflected heat back into his living area, creating a more comfortable environment. Before reaching the 4-year mark of his isolation, he thought he spotted a ship on the horizon. Desperate for rescue, he yelled and waved a white cloth above his head, hoping to catch the crew's attention. He also stoked his fire to produce thick, black smoke, a signal meant to alert anyone who might be nearby. But it was too late. The vessel sailed on, oblivious to his plight. As 6 years came and went, the man faced the harsh realities of living in solitude. With no means to cut his hair, beard, or nails, he became unrecognizable. His once light brown skin darkened under the relentless sun, becoming rough and thick, resembling alligator skin or the shell of an armadillo. The elements had taken their toll, and he had adapted to the harsh environment, both psychologically and physically. Through resilience and creativity, he transformed his survival situation into a sustainable way of life, learning to thrive in solitude on the island, even as the hope of rescue faded into the distance. It had been 7.5 years since his fishing boat capsized after a long, dangerous swim in the Pacific Ocean to reach the shore of an island that took 45 minutes to reach from his sunken vessel. After washing ashore, he learned to make fire, fish without equipment, store rainwater, build a shelter, and construct a small boat to navigate around the island. As he reflected on his time there, he often wondered what had happened to the other men on the fishing boat. Were they alive? Had they faced worse fate? Suddenly, he heard a rustling noise behind him in the thick trees. Instinctively, he took cover, grasping his makeshift weapon, and waited. To his astonishment, it was another human, a person. He stood up slowly, making sure it wasn't a mirage. The stranger began speaking in Spanish. Hola, hermano cristiano. Hola, hermano. The man recognized the language, but hadn't spoken it in many years. Overcome with emotion, he started to run towards the other man, and they stood facing each other, eyes wide with disbelief. Then, without hesitation, they embraced. The newcomer explained that his boat had capsized just 2 nights ago. As they shared their stories, both men felt a renewed sense of hope and camaraderie, realizing they were no longer alone on this desolate island. After several days of living together on the deserted island, Robert took it upon himself to teach the new arrival essential skills needed for survival. Each morning, Robert would demonstrate how to collect rainwater using makeshift containers and how to fish from the rocky shore where they both sought refuge. By the 6th day, Robert felt it was time to show how to build a proper shelter to protect them from the elements. ¿Cómo te llamas? Robert asked one afternoon as they gathered materials. Me llamo Robert, he replied with a nod. Mi nombre es Jesus Martinez Alexander Gomez. Jesus Martin introduced himself, his voice warm despite the rough circumstances. As the days turned into weeks, their camaraderie deepened. Robert patiently taught Jesus how to catch food, showing him the best fishing spots and the techniques he had perfected. Over the years, they worked side by side, each contributing to their survival in this harsh environment. However, as time passed, the initially welcoming atmosphere soured. Tensions began to rise, fueled by unspoken frustrations and the isolation they both felt. Robert had no idea that Jesus harbored a growing resentment beneath the surface, feeling overshadowed by the skills Robert had so confidently shared. To ease the strain, Robert suggested they divide the island into sections, giving each man his own space. They agreed, hoping this would restore harmony between them. After what felt like an eternity, Robert approached Jesus one evening, eager to mend their relationship. They sat for hours, discussing their fears and dreams, and finally shook hands, a gesture of newfound understanding. Months went by, and the island felt both familiar and suffocating. One afternoon, Jesus, restless and desperate for freedom, proposed they attempt to leave the island using the small boat that had been anchored nearby. The boat can't handle the waves, especially not with those 50-foot swells, Robert cautioned, his voice edged with concern. Despite Robert's warnings, Jesus felt The pull of the open sea. He waited patiently until he was sure Robert was asleep, lulled into a deep slumber by exhaustion. Under the cover of darkness, Seuss quietly gathered supplies, canned food, fresh water, and the tools they had fashioned together. He loaded the small boat, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. With one last glance back at the shelter they had built, he untied the boat from the dock and pushed it gently into the vast Pacific Ocean. The night was still, the stars twinkling overhead as Jesus jumped in and began to paddle away from the island, each stroke taking him further from the life he had known. The next morning, Robert awoke to the sun's warm rays filtering through the trees. He brewed a cup of coffee and sliced a piece of dried turtle meat that had been curing in the sun for over a week. Calling out Seuss, he assumed his friend was still asleep or exploring the island. Hours passed, and unease began to creep in. "Seuss!" Robert shouted, his voice echoing against the cliffs. When there was no response, he shrugged it off, thinking perhaps Seuss was gathering more supplies. But as the day wore on, the unsettling feeling grew. Panic set in when Robert rushed to the dock and found the boat missing. Dropping to his knees in despair, he realized the gravity of the situation. Seuss had left without him. Days later, as Robert walked along the shore, he spotted something floating in the water. His heart sank as he recognized the lifeless form of Seuss washing ashore. Rushing to the beach, he dragged Seuss's body onto the sand, grief overwhelming him. With trembling hands, Robert dug a shallow grave, using the rough rocks at hand to create a makeshift cross. He whispered a prayer, his voice cracking with sorrow, as he laid Jesus to rest, covering him with dirt and marking the grave with the crude cross. In that moment, Robert felt the weight of solitude more profoundly than ever before, understanding all too well the cost of survival in a world that had become so unforgiving. Months had passed since Robert had found Jesus washed up on the shore, but the isolation felt surreal. After 3 years of companionship, the solitude returned with a vengeance, reminding him of the 10 long, unforgiving years since his fishing boat had capsized. He had set out that fateful day to fish and bring supplies back to his town. His wife, Sarah, was 6 months pregnant when he left, expecting him home in a few weeks, no more than a month at most. Robert often found himself lost in thought, wondering what his child looked like. Had he been blessed with a daughter or a son who could carry on the family name? The lineage of the Andersons stretched back generations, with Robert Ivan Anderson IV being the name he had hoped to pass on. Now, he imagined his child, who would be 10 years old, growing up without him. As 6 more months drifted by, it felt as though time had forgotten him entirely. He had grown accustomed to the sound of the waves and the rustle of leaves, but one afternoon, an unfamiliar sound broke the monotony. Sitting up in his makeshift treehouse, he felt a spark of hope as he grabbed his spyglass, crafted from tree bark, twine, and a piece of glass he had found on the beach after his boat capsized. Peering through the spyglass, he spotted a boat approaching the island. He rubbed his eyes, questioning whether he was dreaming or if this was real. The boat drew closer, and his heart raced. Filled with urgency, he tossed aside the spyglass and descended from the treehouse, leaping down without bothering to touch the ladder. Running across the hot sand, he waved his arms and shouted, "I'm here. Hey, I'm right here." As the boat neared, he could make out the crew members on board. One of them exclaimed, "What in God's name is that?" Some of the men appeared frightened, unable to recognize Robert as a human being after years of solitude. Desperate, Robert began chanting a Christian prayer, hoping to convey his humanity. When the crew heard his voice carrying across the waves, one man said, "That isn't a monster, it's a man." The lifeboat reached the shore, and as the crew members hopped out, Robert dropped to his knees, hands clasped together, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for saving me," he cried. The crew wrapped him in a blanket, asking questions that felt surreal after so long. "What's your name? How did you get here? How long have you been stranded?" Overwhelmed, Robert shouted, "We can't leave. We need to bring Jesus back." Confused glances passed among the crew. "Jesus who?" one asked. "Another man," Robert explained, his voice trembling. "He was here with me many summers ago. He tried to leave on a boat I made, but it wasn't safe for the ocean. He died, and I buried him on the island." The captain instructed some crew members to locate Jesus' grave so they could honor him and allow his family to say goodbye. Finding the marked grave was easy, and Robert felt a mix of relief and sorrow as they prepared to leave the island. The journey back to Spain took 2 days, and as they sailed, Robert's mind swirled with thoughts of home. He missed the comforts of civilization, feeding on cooked meals, taking long showers, and wearing shoes, which he hadn't done in 10 years. As they approached the shore, a crew member pulled Robert aside, delivering news that filled him with hope. "Your wife, Sarah, has been looking for you this whole time. She never remarried, and she knew you were still alive." "How do you know this?" Robert asked, his heart racing. "We just got off the phone with her," the crewman replied. "Your son can't wait to meet you." Robert's breath caught in his throat. "She had a boy? What did she name him?" The man paused for a moment, pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and said, "Robert Ivan Anderson IV." Tears streamed down Robert's face, a mix of disbelief and overwhelming joy washing over him. He had thought he was lost forever, but now he was on the brink of being reunited with his family. The anticipation of meeting his son filled him with hope, and for the first time in years, he felt the warmth of life returning to his heart. After a few hours of receiving the devastating news about his wife and child, Robert finally docked and departed from the ship, accompanied by the captain and several crew members who escorted him to the waiting ambulance. Once inside, the EMTs swiftly assessed his condition. taking his blood pressure and body temperature while monitoring his vital signs. They initiated an IV to rehydrate him with fluids, explaining that he would likely be kept in the hospital for a few days to conduct tests and ensure nothing was overlooked in his treatment. As the chaos of the day settled within him, Robert closed his eyes and began to drift into sleep, envisioning Jesus lying face down in the water. In this dreamlike state, he found himself back on the island, where he saw Jesus chopping wood for the evening fire. When Jesus noticed him, he paused, stood up, and waved with his free hand, leaving Robert feeling a mix of confusion and familiarity. Intrigued, Robert walked toward his treehouse. He climbed the rope ladder and entered, where he laid on his makeshift bed, legs stretched out, and hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling and pondering whether he was truly back on the island or merely dreaming. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling his name. Robert, I need help. Robert, but he dismissed it, mumbling in his sleep, no, you're dead. You're not real. The gentle repetition of his name finally coaxed him awake as a nurse softly urged him, Robert, Robert, Robert. As his eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the bright, blurry light, he discerned a woman in uniform, a man in a white coat, and, turning his head to the left, caught sight of a striking woman with red hair styled elegantly, her skin pale and eyes a vivid green. She wore a blue dress paired with a white thin sweater. Beside her stood a chubby-faced boy of about 10. Sporting brown hair, with dark circles under his eyes, dressed in a polo shirt and khaki shorts, both of whom seemed to hold a peculiar significance in Robert's bewildered state. He looked intently at the boy and asked, Are you Robert Anderson IV? The boy glanced at his mother, seeking permission, and she nodded encouragingly, softly saying, Go ahead. With a hint of pride, the boy replied, Yes, I am. Robert smiled, his heart swelling with emotion as he introduced himself, I'm Robert Anderson III. The boy's eyes widened with excitement, and he asked, Are you my dad? Hearing my dad echoed in the room felt surreal to Robert, and he responded, Yes, I'm your dad. The boy, full of innocent curiosity, asked where he had been. Sarah gently interjected, Robbie, you can't ask, but Robert interrupted, It's fine, he has the right to know. He took a deep breath, recalling the harrowing experience. I went fishing with my boat, alongside a couple of men who needed to support their families too. After a long day at sea, a storm suddenly formed, waves crashing, both of whom and our boat began to fill with water fast. We tried bailing it out, but then a 50-foot wave hit us, capsizing the boat. I managed to cling to some driftwood and washed up on an island about 600 kilometers away, surrounded by dense trees, turtles, and crab. The boy's eyes widened further as he asked, What was the island called? Robert replied, I think it's called Lost Time Island. In Spanish, it's La Isla Perdida, which sounds much prettier. After the nurse and doctor had left, Robert embraced Sarah tightly, whispering that he had thought of her every single day. She replied with a heartfelt, Me too. Turning to his son, he cradled his face in his hands, expressing how he had been eager to discover whether he would be a boy or a girl after 10 long years of waiting. Following a few days in the hospital, the doctor gave him a clean bill of health and discharged him. As the days turned into weeks, life felt both different and the same. The psychologist advised that it would take time for him to readjust, possibly months or even years. Even so, he continued to dream of the island. The next day, reporters camped out at his front door, and he received a call from Jesus's family. Answering the phone, he said, Hello? Is this Robert? A woman asked. Yes, who is this? I'm Jesus's wife, Rebecca. Robert felt a rush of nerves as he replied, Oh, hey, hi. She continued, I want to thank you for bringing my husband home. You didn't have to do that, he was already buried. Robert responded sincerely, I couldn't just leave him there. I wouldn't want anyone to abandon me on an island far from my family. Rebecca understood without needing to say so, adding, If there's anything we can do for you, please let me know. We owe you our lives. As time passed, Robert began to settle into his new yet familiar life. Within 6 months, he transitioned from fishing to working in construction, never returning to the ocean. He attended Jesus' funeral, honored to be invited. Sarah and Robert renewed their vows, solidifying their bond. With the help of an expert, Robert wrote a book about his experiences, which went on to sell 3.4 million copies. They bought a new house and generously gifted $1.5 million to Jesus' wife and children, as well as his parents, while setting aside money for Robbie's college tuition. Robert then launched his first business, Robert & Sons Carpentry Construction and more. As Robbie grew up, he began working alongside his dad, following in the footsteps of generations before them. Robert discovered a unique talent for building anything he envisioned, whether it was a rocking chair, a crib, or a gazebo. Each project felt like a challenge that redefined his identity. Once known solely as a fisherman, he embraced his new identity as a carpenter and contractor, perhaps a subconscious challenge from those who once knew him. Robbie eventually took over the thriving business, which had flourished since its inception, and recently got engaged, marking the beginning of yet another chapter in their family's legacy. To a beautiful Spanish girl, just 20 years old, hailing from the illustrious Bourbon family, one of the wealthiest families in Spain, Robbie found a love that transcended social status. Her father and brothers admired Robbie's father for his resilience, recognizing the strength he displayed in overcoming adversity when the universe seemed determined to bring him down. However, they affectionately teased that Robert Anderson was a bit of a goon, endearing him further to the family. Robbie and his fiancée tied the knot the following spring in an extravagant wedding that was nothing short of a fairy tale, with both families boasting large numbers of relatives in attendance. The ceremony featured 10 best men and 10 bridesmaids, along with 3 flower girls. and 2 ring bearers, creating a vibrant tapestry of love and celebration. The interior designs harmonized beautifully, showcasing a stunning array of colors that delighted the senses, while reporters later announced that the wedding total reached an astounding $112.6 million. Although Sarah, Robbie's mother, passed away before the wedding due to complications from typhoid fever and bacteria in the water, her spirit was felt throughout the day, as she had met Robbie's fiancé and given her blessing. 10 years after his son's wedding, Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a legacy of love and strength. Robbie and his wife grew old together, nurturing a family that included 5 boys and 1 daughter. Robbie lived a full life, passing away at the age of 89, while his wife left this world at 79. Their eldest son, Robert Ivan Anderson V, married, so did the 4 boys and daughter, all gave Robert 15 grandkids he will never meet. Robert V inherited Robert and Sons, continuing the family legacy. Jesus' children, 2 daughters, have grown up without a father, but thanks to Robert giving them the lump sum of money from his books, Maria and Samantha both became doctors. Maria works at a hospital and Samantha works at a low-income clinic. Jesus' wife Mary never remarried, raised her 2 daughters alone. She passed away the morning of Jesus' 15th anniversary. Robert books have been collecting royalty in the revenue of $100,000 a year in royalties. The experiences of Robert Ivan Anderson III and Jesus Gomez are not unique. Similar scenarios occur frequently in literature and real life. A notable example is the classic novel, Robinson Crusoe, which tells the story of a man stranded on a barren island with minimal resources, lacking trees, stones, and often only sand, especially when high tides threaten to submerge it. This narrative draws parallels with historical figures like Alexander Selkirk and Pedro Serrano, who also faced isolation. However, it is important to note that these stories, including that of Robinson Crusoe, are primarily crafted for entertainment purposes. The characters, events, and names presented in this tale are fictional and not based on real individuals or occurrences. Any similarities to actual people or events are purely coincidental and not intentional.